Welcome to the Daily Friend Show, where we discuss, analyse and debate the current issues of the day. The show is proudly brought to you by the Institute of Race Relations in conjunction with the Big Liberty Show. And today we have a guest, colleague David Ansara, who is the COO of the Centre for Risk Analysis. David, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Excellent. With you is our regulars, Terence Corrigan, Project Manager, and Nicholas Lorimer, the PA to the CEO of the IRR. It's an alphabet soup you should
Executive
belong
Assistant.
to. Executive Assistant?
I know, fancy.
Yeah, didn't realize. Okay. David, we've invited you on because you've had an extremely interesting time recently. You attended a conference in China. I'm really looking for you to tell us about both the conference and your impressions of China generally, insofar as I do understand you only went to Beijing.
Yeah, that's correct. Thanks very much, Sarah. I had a very interesting trip to Beijing. I was there as a delegate representing the Centre for Risk Analysis on behalf of the Institute of Race Relations. So the centre is a unit of the IRR, which focuses on policy issues, political risk, and scenario planning. And we were invited to attend the Conference on Dialogue of Asian Civilizations, which was a large showpiece for the Chinese government to showcase its soft power and to position itself as a leader in the Asian region. And really, obviously, the role of the Chinese within that region in terms of hard power has been the center of attention in terms of military and economic power and its ability to project its power, to far-flung jurisdictions in Asia, including Pakistan, Sri Lanka, the former Soviet republics, as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. That has been well documented. But in terms of its soft power, the government was basically using this as an opportunity to say that all civilizations are equal. No civilization is superior to another or inferior to another. And I think there was a dig at recent comments that were made in the United States about a kind of a clash of civilizations. So the famous Samuel Huntington treaties about different civilizations being these kind of fixed entities and inevitably clashing with one another. Huntington was often referred to in the discussions, and there was a firm rejection of that thesis. And so, in some ways, some of the language was about mutual understanding and shared dialogue between civilizations. And there was an assumption that these civilizations existed, but that they could, through collaboration and cross-cultural dialogue, they could achieve some kind of a more collaborative model.
Very much soft power stuff.
But underlying this was the recent trade war with the United States and the Trump administration, and that was really the elephant in the room in these discussions. And President Xi Jinping actually addressed the opening ceremony and made reference to this. I think part of the broader macro picture here is about China also repositioning itself as the standard bearers for globalization. Mm-hmm. Their prosperity has really been generated through engaging very actively with the international trade system, and their ascension to the World Trade Organization in 2001 really marked the beginning of this kind of new era of aggressively exploiting global trade. And obviously there have been issues around Huawei, with the chief executive being arrested, and Huawei's 5G technology very much integrated into American technology firms. So I think what we have is the rise of this new world order, where you have these, in the post-Cold War era, you have these two very large powers that up until now have been very deeply interconnected and very much collaborating. And if you read the Economist a couple of weeks ago, speaking about this new Cold War, and a lot of those commercial connections and those trade connections that bound those two powers together are starting to fray, I think the consequences for the global capitalist system are going to be quite profound. So that's the broader context of the conference. The CRA delivered a paper looking at the Chinese model of development and the implications for Africa, and actually Nicholas was the primary author on that. I delivered a short presentation on that. So, which was well received, and we looked at some of the really phenomenal statistics around growth in per capita income over the last 30 years since Deng Xiaoping started to liberalize the economy, and so income levels, standard of living, and I mean you can see it just walking around. Just the scale of development is quite profound. I think there are a lot of lessons there. Whether or not that model is replicable in other parts of the world, at one of the think tanks that I visited, I asked this question, and they said, well, the Chinese conditions are quite specific. They have a very unique set of institutional arrangements and a political culture and history there. So, but nevertheless, is the story of our time is how China was able to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It's quite extraordinary and very interesting to witness firsthand.
I just want to remind viewers that the Daily Friend featured the article that David referred to in the, I think it was yesterday's, the Sunday edition of the Daily Friend. Just a sort of observational issue. I was in China 1995, 96, and the development wasn't on display at that stage. There were a lot of old-fashioned issues. But what I found fascinating is that everything about China, all the landmarks, the temples, the wall, etc., were big. Everything was big. And probably one of the most striking was Tiananmen Square, which I believe has 1 million 1 meter square blocks to accommodate 1 million people in. And you that's where you get a sort of visceral sense of Chinese power. I don't know if you share the same views on that.
Yeah, and a very long history where the Ming Dynasty, the Qing Dynasty. I mean, these were vast empires that controlled enormous territories, and I think part of the specific conditions of China is that there's been a centralized state there for a very long time, and there's been various oscillations between different groups, but for the most part, they've had this established set of state institutions with a kind of a bureaucracy that has run it, and I guess a lot of the themes of this conference was about China reclaiming its rightful place as this central civilization, and Peter Frankopan, who's a well-known historian who wrote the Silk Road, that was his kind of the core argument of his speech was, that this is just that China's decline was a momentary lapse, and you go to the National Museum and they have the China Rejuvenation exhibition, which is filled with Marxist rhetoric about anti-imperialism and defeating the capitalist bureaucrats and the capitalist roaders. But in many ways, that prosperity has been driven by just embracing quite like Wild West free market capitalism, with this kind of big state at the center of it, which is quite a paradox and quite difficult for Western thinkers to get their heads around.
Before I move into that other little part of China called Taiwan, I just wanted to ask you whether anyone you encountered had a view on South Africa. Yeah,
so I mean, the conference was attended by countries from all over Asia, even from the Middle East. So there were Lebanese and Israelis and former Soviet republics, as I mentioned. And many of them, when it came to South Africa, were, some were not very well informed, but others kind of knew the history. And, there seemed to be a tinge of regret in the comments, South Africa has so much potential. It could have been so much greater. And, often people would ask me about the economy, and I'd say, well, it's not doing great. It's growing at 0.7%. They'd mishear me and say, 7%, that's pretty good. Like, no, 0.7%. Oh, dear. And, I think this contrast of extremes, I think China's development has come at a cost, environmental cost and just this massive disruption to society. But there is just the sense of that they're relentlessly moving forward, and there might be some underlying problems in the economy that we will see materialize over the next few years in terms of credit and the housing bubble, just this drastic investment in infrastructure and everything. But
they are at least relentlessly moving forward.
Yeah, and there's the sense of that that is their number one goal, and everyone's kind of coordinated on that. And I just think that South Africa, maybe this is something that has characterized us for a long time, but a very insular, inward-looking place in a way. And we do have unique conditions here, but there are a lot of lessons that we can take from other parts of the world. And there were other Asian countries there, like Malaysia, and many of the delegates there were complaining about their affirmative action policy, saying that it's been captured by a politically connected elite, which I thought sounded very familiar.
That sounds, yes.
So, and if you look at Singapore, Hong Kong is part of China now, but these are countries that South Korea that actively embrace capitalism and free trade, and have fundamentally transformed their economies. And I think it shows what's possible if you have the right mix of policy and drive and determination.
Terence, and on to that disputed little island, Taiwan. The equivalent of the Supreme Court in Taiwan has ordered the Parliament to draft legislation recognizing same-sex marriage. It has become the first Asian country that will formally recognize same-sex marriage, despite the fact that probably the sense is that the majority are not really necessarily in favor. The part of the world.
Well, look, I'd just like to pick up on something that David said initially. From what I'm hearing, to see this conference as a repudiation of Samuel Huntington's thesis, I think is misplaced. The actual title of his original article was "A Clash of Civilizations?" ? Which is often forgotten. And it seems, frankly, that the Chinese are replicating his argument exactly, that there are civilizations, and that these fall into distinct families, and you have to find some sort of cooperative model. But fundamentally, they seem to take his logic. Now, the reason I raise that is because I've heard that argument again and again from Chinese diplomats. In fact, I was at a conference in Berlin a couple of years ago, and a senior member of their foreign affairs team was saying, "Yes, we believe in democracy, we believe in human rights," and then he also had this conspiratorial smile on his face, "but with a Chinese understanding." And
Which is distinctly not ours.
Well, that seemed to throw a door open as wide as you could force it. Now, what is this to do with Taiwan? Well, Taiwan, or the Republic of China, as it called itself, comes from exactly the same cultural milieu as mainland China, but it is a very, very different society. I spent a number of years there. I have family that lives there, so I can speak about this with some knowledge, if not not without some passion as well. The cultural framework is Sinic, and something I learned during my time there was that culture matters. To sort of dismiss it as some sort of function of racism or whatever is futile. The way people think, is influenced by the way they're raised, by the historical or their religious background, and it takes a while to get used to that, because your assumptions are not necessarily valid. But Taiwan has also embraced a lot of, for want of a better expression, Western liberal thinking. Remember that as recently as the 1980s, its government was a hardcore authoritarian state, what they called the White Terror. People of my age could remember, for instance, being punished at school for speaking Taiwanese rather than Chinese. The Kuomintang was literally translates as the Chinese Nationalist Party.
Okay.
Yes, but over generations, a few things happened. First of all, that political association with China, I think, died off. The ethnic Taiwanese, who had come in successive waves of immigration, I don't think ever really had it. In fact, there's a lot of Chiang Kai-shek is a very contested figure on the island, which many people don't know. But more than that, the involvement of the United States, and I'm not talking just about American military or whatever or trade. I'm talking about like popular culture. That really started to influence the way that the Taiwanese thought. Now, on the same-sex marriage issue, their first gay pride parade in Taipei was in 2003, and I happened to be in the country at the time, and it was very interesting that the mayor of Taipei actually addressed it at a time when many politicians in what we might consider more enlightened parts of the world would have run a mile. Over the years, there have been sort of challenges towards this. Public opinion has vacillated. My sense of it when I lived there was that most Taiwanese actually had a fairly traditional view of marriage, and certainly 2 years ago there was a referendum in Taiwan, or last year, wasn't it? Well, recent anyway, where a majority of people rejected the idea. What it has had, though, is very strong elite sympathy from predominantly from the DPP, Tsai Ing-wen, the current president of Taiwan. These tend to be the more independence, formal independence-minded, but also from some within the Kuomintang. When what the court said was that there are certain constitutional principles, and this is pretty much what happened in America or whatever, and then the legislature is instructed to adjust things accordingly. The Kuomintang, for instance, allowed its members a free vote, and a number of them actually went with that. So, I think this shows a few things. First of all, that to the extent that this is a more open, freedom-focused, liberal system of thought, your base culture is not necessarily incapable of adaptation. And I think this is something that mainland China would actually like, an idea that they would actually like to promote, that fundamentally we are Chinese and we are in our cultural box. That delegitimizes talk about democracy and whatever. Taiwan is a fully fledged democracy. They changed their government a few times, which is more than we can say, and its press is probably the freest in Asia, maybe competing with Japan. But certainly, the sort of Asian values narrative, it's just not really applicable there, or it's severely challenged. On the other hand, I sound some caution here in that this does seem to reflect this kind of dominance of the courts in policy making. I mean, you recall when the American Supreme Court pronounced on this, and President Obama had the White House letter. Someone pointed out, well, he didn't have the courage to actually lead this himself. He waited for the courts to do it. And I think that we've seen similar things in South Africa, and I think that there is a certain failure of democratic leadership there. If this is something that you support, don't hand the problem to the judges. Go out there and convince. Let this be something that comes from popular sentiment.
Just an issue. I think there's generally an underestimation of the financial power of what in South Africa would be the pink rand. Because gays tend to be, obviously very broad generalization, but highly educated, skilled, in high-earning jobs. So they are financially an attractive, let's put a tax option for a government.
Look, I think that it's homosexual people who feel that they can step out of the closet with no consequences would tend to fit that profile. I think as you go into poorer or more traditional communities where your sense of self is bound up with the values of the people around you, that becomes a lot more difficult. Interestingly, though, Taiwan is quite different because my understanding is that that's never been a commercialized thing. even though there are some businesses that kind of advertise themselves as gay friendly or whatever, the Taiwan Pride March, for instance, I don't think is actually sponsored. It's very much a kind of social movement pressing for a very distinct type of political equality or whatever. And maybe that's the luxury of being an affluent society, that you can sort of afford to dispense with the sponsors. But yes, no. Look, Cape Town is trying to market itself as a gay-friendly tourism destination. Brighton in England, I understand the same thing. Amsterdam, and certainly, I think one of the main issues there is that certainly until recently, and this might well change, homosexual couples are far less likely to have children. So you have just that much less that you have to spend on exorbitant school fees and things like that.
Oh dear, yes. Nicholas, the delay in Cyril Ramaphosa announcing his cabinet, why do you think so?
I think there's a lot of factionism going on behind the scenes within the ANC. We've seen a couple of key members of the NEC, David Mabuza and Mvula Makanyane, holding back on going into parliament. It's, as we've talked about on the show a little bit before, it's not entirely clear why this is, but it seems to be that there's some complicated internal dynamics going on. And so there's probably a lot of horse trading and disputes behind the scenes as to who exactly is going to come in to take up those cabinet roles, which come with an awful amount of patronage attached to them, as well as political power. I think it was someone on Twitter joked that if this was Zuma, he would have already announced and reshuffled the cabinet by now. So maybe it's actually a good thing that it's taking a little bit more time. To
what extent is the delay likely to have been exacerbated by the public protector coming out late last week and finding Pravin Gordhan guilty of, shall we say, mismanaging the retirement of Ivan Pillay?
It's difficult to say because the government has, the ANC leaders have traditionally picked and chosen when exactly they're going to listen to court findings or public protector findings or that kind of thing. So that might just be another aspect of the internal battles within the ANC, because I think it's probably quite likely that the public protector is fairly politicized and used as a weapon within internal ANC battles. You've seen that Malema has been chipping in with comments the entire time, which probably speaks to at least the faction that's friendly to him within the ANC. It seems to be he's maybe channeling some of their ideas. So, for example, he said that David Mabuza must be made deputy president, and that Pravin Gordhan shouldn't run anything. So it's interesting to look at that.
Terence, the former CEO and then campaign manager of the DA, Jonathan Mokes, has resigned. Apparently he was going to resign, decided to resign 3 months before the election. Is that a good thing? Is it enough? Should more heads be, if not voluntarily rolling, then being rolled?
I'm rather less intrigued by the idea of heads rolling than what's in the heads themselves. I think that you can hold people accountable for their electoral showing. It's people use words like disaster or whatever. Well, they're still the second biggest party. They declined by something over 1 percentage point, and that's certainly deeply concerning. But it's not the end of the world. They still have a machine. They still have the loyalty of 1 in 5 South Africans. So they can turn the ship around. I think what was most interesting in his letter was we have to decide what the DA is. Now, Mrs. Ziller then chipped in, firing on all cylinders and from all barrels in report.
As she's wont to do.
As she's wont to do, yes. Talking about how she has to take some responsibility for the seepage of race nationalism into the DA. I think that's 100%. I think that what the DA implicitly tried to do in the last election was to mimic enough of the ANC that people who like this sort of thing would feel comfortable there. But I think it masks it marks a fundamental problem. If you like the original, why go for a pallid copy? If you want a PlayStation, why buy a sort of Hong Kong knockoff product?
It's cheaper.
Well, unfortunately, this is one area where you don't have to pay any money. So yes, they
Get what you pay for.
get what you pay for,
Taxation,
right?
yeah.
Yeah. So they went down this road, managed to alienate part of their constituency, didn't articulate anything particularly new or exciting. In fact, it was just if the idea was we'll just be a sort of better and less kind of off the wall version of the ANC. Really what.
No one was really
Well,
interested.
If you want the ANC, you got the cadre deployment, you got the colours, you got the history, you got the venal, all of the aboves. Okay, if you want a more extreme version, the EFF will give that to you. Why would you really want something that's kind of we just don't like you very much, and we'll be more honest with it's not a message that's going to
More honest and efficient.
more honest and efficient, and we don't bang the racial drum quite so much, but it's
Just a little.
It's enough to chase people away, not enough to encourage anyone else there. So yes, I think that if this is where the DA wants to go, then they must resign themselves to what they are, possibly being overtaken by the EFF, because the type of politics that they seem to be attempting to replicate now would place virtually the entire South African spectrum in that race nationalist sphere. And I think, unfortunately, an idea like that is always going to be more attractive when you have more of it on offer. And I think it does a great disservice to the country to leave open, the space for real non-racism, some sort of workable, growth-oriented future. And just coming back to the whole China example, it's very interesting that the Chinese themselves, despite a little bit of rhetorical flourish here and there, have ditched communism. In fact, a couple of years ago, the Communist Party of China sent out a memo saying, don't call each other comrade anymore. It's archaic. It's stupid. Call each other Mr. and Mrs. Or, doctor when you come back from Harvard. Here we still are locked in the idea, not only that this is a good way to think, but we still seem to have this bizarre view that this is how the Chinese think. Perhaps the solution is to, send some very important people to live in China for a while.
Nicholas, just from a DA perspective, the DA slowly but eventually fairly significantly grew on the basis of classical liberal principles, and take it obviously with a measure of pragmatism. But with this election, that seems to have clearly stopped and reversed. And one could say, well, the DA was doing fine, attracting people with classical liberal principles. Why shouldn't it carry on doing so?
Exactly, because voters appreciate authenticity, a feeling of authenticity. So what's interesting is that Helen Zille continues to be more popular than the DA, even amongst black supporters. So one of the reasons for this is because they may not necessarily agree with everything she says, but they believe that she means it. So she comes across as very genuine, and voters, particularly in our modern age, tend to like genuineness. One of the reasons that Donald Trump managed to win such support in the Republican Party was that he was seen to be a genuine person, and that he's not trying to fool you with marketing speak. And unfortunately, Musi's main problem is that he comes across very much as the pastor who's trying to sell you something.
Okay.
I think it's very good that Jonathan Mokes has gone, though. He actually was an enormous architect of a lot of this DA slide away from its principles. And he also was responsible for the narrative that came out after the election that actually this was a good thing that the racists should stop voting for the DA. That memo that was sent to all party structures bore his name.
Okay. Finally, can we look at an issue that seems a little silly but actually has very serious implications, and that is Tito Mbowene's tweet. Perhaps you can fill us in on that.
So Tito Mboweni tweeted that he was tired of the media calling Cyril Ramaphosa by his first name. He said, no more Cyril this, Cyril that. It's President Ramaphosa. The media needs to get it right. And there was a little bit of pushback on Twitter for this. It was actually quite a big tweet for South African political Twitter. You often don't see that much engagement, and yet this one was several thousand likes on his original tweet. But there were a lot of responses from people saying things like, we elected him. We get to call him what we like. And I think that goes to the sort of heart of exactly the way a republic is supposed to work. A republic is you choose a citizen who is honored to serve the res publica, as its head, and he very much works for the Republic and for its betterment, and you have ultimate control of him. The relationship is of between equals. He's just another citizen. He's not your lord and master. But there's a tendency in republics all over the world, you see this also even in the United States, to kind of adopt this imperial character, where particularly when there's a president, to hold themselves up a higher above everyone else, to have all these trappings of office, to have big ceremonies behind their name. Look, I'm not opposed to constitutional monarchy, but then we should have a king and a parliament, not someone who's supposed to be the people's servant who's suddenly holding himself above us.
It raises two issues. The one, of course, is that as soon as you're starting to circumscribe how people are called, you're limiting free speech, and then you're looking at the tendency in Africa to put in legislation which you may not insult the leader, and there's a slippery slope there. And the other thing is the fact that people calling him Cyril largely comes across as a sign of affection and even respect, whereas Jacob Zuma, certainly by the end of his tenure, you never called him Jacob unless you actually wanted to make a joke or tease. You called him Zuma or worse. And I think Tito Mboweni is missing a bit of a trick there. It's not that the people don't. It's not that people don't show respect. It's just that they have a certain comfort zone that he will do something for them.
Exactly, and I think Terence pointed out actually before the show was that this is partly by design. He's really tried to be friendly and approachable and open, and he's really tried to engage with people on a very human level. So they shouldn't be complaining about it, because that's exactly the image he's been going for.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap up there, and thank you very much for joining us. Please consider joining the IRR in the fight for the battle of ideas, and to do so, all you have to do is SMS to your name, essentially, to 32823, and somebody will contact you to sign you up. The SMS costs R1, and terms and conditions do apply. See you again next time.